He told me he wanted a companion to share his quiet library, someone to sit across from him at empty dinner tables. He didn't want a wife, and he certainly didn't speak of love. Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Before we begin, take a breath. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If you believe some stories are meant to be felt more than told, then you're in the right place. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. The reality of my new life began not with a grand ceremony, but in a sterile, glass-walled office in downtown Boston, far removed from the crumbling, noisy neighborhood where I had spent my entire life. I still remembered the heavy, distinct scratch of a fountain pen moving across thick parchment. The companion contract lay between us, a formal paper agreement outlining a strictly non-romantic arrangement with separate living wings and clear emotional boundaries. Alistair Vance had sat across from me, a man constructed of winter stone and immaculate restraint. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the clinical light of the room, his silver-flecked hair combed back with meticulous, unforgiving precision. My father's suffocating debts had vanished, overnight with a single stroke of Alistair's pen. My father had left behind ledgers full of red ink, unpaid medical bills from my mother's final years, and threats that had kept me awake for countless nights. The burden had been a physical weight on my chest, a constant, gnawing panic that made it hard to breathe. Alistair had reviewed those devastating numbers with the dispassionate efficiency of a man accustomed to buying empires. He didn't ask for explanations, and he certainly didn't offer pity. It was a transaction, pure and simple, an acquisition intended to stave off the hollow echoes of a massive, empty estate. I was to be a fixture, a silent presence to occupy the vast, lonely spaces of his life, and in return, I was saved from absolute ruin. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. Now, 3 weeks into our arrangement, I was beginning to understand the true weight of the world I had entered. The morning light in New England did not behave like the sunlight I was accustomed to. Here, inside the Vance estate, the dawn filtered through ancient cedarwood trees, casting long, fractured shadows across the cold marble floors. It was a sterile, beautiful kind of light, illuminating the lazy dust motes that danced in the vast, vaulted library, without ever managing to actually warm the heavy, silent air. The silence had become our shared language, a careful dance of avoiding each other's emotional edges, while sitting only a few feet apart. I sat in a high-backed armchair near the grand fireplace, a heavy leather-bound novel resting in my lap. Its pages smelled faint and sharp, a comforting scent like dry autumn leaves and forgotten decades. Across the polished expanse of a massive mahogany reading table sat Alistair. The fireplace was unlit, the cold marble hearth swept meticulously clean, mirroring the emotional temperature of the room. The massive mahogany table that separated us was a boundary line, a physical manifestation of the rules we had agreed upon. He had not looked up from his leather-bound ledger for nearly 40 minutes. The only sound between us was the soft, rhythmic scratch of his fountain pen and the occasional, careful rustle of my turning pages. This was our established routine. It was a quiet rhythm that we both clung to, a safe harbor in a stony New England estate that felt entirely too large for two guarded souls. I watched him covertly from beneath my lashes, studying the sharp lines of his jaw and the rigid set of his shoulders. Alistair was not a man who required conversation to assert his presence. He communicated through the meticulous order of his environment, through the steady, unyielding structure of his days. His emotional distance was constructed through such deliberate respect that it felt like standing in front of a masterpiece in a museum. Allowed to look, but strictly forbidden to touch, he was terrified. I realized slowly of whatever vulnerability lay on the other side of that carefully maintained wall. The tall wooden doors parted silently. Clara Higgins, the estate's housekeeper, stepped into the library. She moved with a practiced, ghostly grace, her dark, starched uniform blending seamlessly into the shadows of the towering bookshelves. Clara was observant, fiercely loyal, and utterly quiet. She understood the rhythm of this cold house better than anyone, acting as a silent helper to my daily navigation of the sprawling estate. Without a single spoken word, she approached the small side table situated between our armchairs and set down a gleaming silver tray. At the center of the tray sat the heavy porcelain teapot. It was an old, hand-painted teapot used to brew warm chamomile tea every morning, serving as a silent medium for our quiet connection. Its faded blue vines crawled delicately up the spout, a stark, domestic contrast to the severe geometry of the library. The warm, earthy scent of chamomile and a faint trace of peppermint immediately bloomed in the chilly air, gently fighting back the dominant smell of old paper and bitter wood polish. "Thank you, Clara," Alistair said. His voice was a low, gravelly hum that resonated deeply in the quiet room, a sound that always sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. He did not look up from his ledger, his focus entirely unbroken. "Will you require anything else, Mr. Vance, ma'am?" Clara asked. Her voice hushed, her eyes respectfully averted as she smoothed her crisp white apron. "Just the tea, that will be all," I answered gently, offering her a small, tight smile of gratitude. Clara offered a brief, respectful nod and vanished as silently as she had arrived, pulling the thick panels shut behind her with a soft, final click. I reached forward, my fingers brushing the smooth, heated curve of the heavy porcelain teapot. The warmth seeped instantly into my perpetually cold hands, a small mercy in a house built of stone. I poured a cup for myself, the pale amber liquid steaming in the chilly morning air, and then carefully poured a second cup. I leaned over and placed it gently near Alistair's elbow. He did not say thank you. He simply stopped writing, laid his pen down parallel to the edge of his leather ledger, and curled his large, calloused hand around the fragile cup. He took a slow sip, his eyes finally lifting to meet mine. They were a pale, striking gray, the color of a stormy winter sky pressing against cold glass. "I trust the East Wing is to your liking, Beatrice," he said. It wasn't exactly a question. It was a formal checking of boundaries, a verbal reinforcement of the companion contract that governed our every interaction. "It is very comfortable, Alistair. The morning light is beautiful," I replied. I kept my voice even, entirely guarded. I held on to my personal dignity like a shield, refusing to let the vastness of his wealth, or the intimidating silence of his house, make me feel small. "Good." He set the cup down with a soft clink against the matching saucer. "I want to be perfectly clear about our arrangement as we settle into this routine. You have the East Wing. I have the West. I will not intrude upon your privacy, nor will I expect you to entertain my associates unless previously discussed. There are no emotional expectations here. You are safe. You will want for nothing material. I ask only for your presence in this library during the mornings, and perhaps to share the silence of the dining room at night." The words were polite, meticulously respectful, and utterly agonizing in their emotional sterility. He wasn't building a wall to keep me out. He was preserving a barrier to protect himself. He was determined to ensure that neither of us became an emotional liability to the other, clinging to control as if it were a life raft in a churning sea. "I understand the terms perfectly," I said softly, picking up my leather-bound novel once more. My hands trembled just a fraction of an inch, though I prayed he couldn't see it from across the table. "I am entirely content with silence. A lie, perhaps, but a necessary one." I read for another 20 minutes, though I scarcely registered the words printed on the page. When the antique grandfather clock in the hall chimed the top of the hour, I knew it was time for his morning business calls. I closed the book, intending to leave it flat on the armrest, having forgotten to grab a scrap of paper to mark my place in the chapter. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my simple woolen dress. "I will leave you to your work." Alistair stood the moment I did. It was a reflexive, old-world courtesy that he never failed to observe, a testament to the stoic, protective nature hidden beneath his impossibly cold exterior. "Have a good afternoon, Beatrice." I turned and walked toward the exit. But just before I reached for the brass handle, I glanced back over my shoulder, unable to stop myself. Alistair was not looking at his ledger. He was standing by my empty armchair. In his large, steady hand, he held a thin silver bookmark. With excruciating care, he opened my leather-bound novel, found the exact paragraph where my eyes had last rested, and slipped the silver metal between the delicate pages. He closed the book gently, aligning it precisely on the table edge. He had tracked my pace. He knew exactly where I had stopped reading, despite never having explicitly glanced in my direction. He demanded a life of no emotional expectations, yet his actions spoke a language of silent, undeniable devotion. I swallowed the tight knot forming in my throat, turned the brass handle, and stepped out into the cold hallway without making a sound. The afternoon eventually gave way to a bruised, violet twilight. The grand estate, already quiet during the daylight hours, took on a profoundly heavy stillness. As the sun dipped below the tree line, the ancient cedarwood trees outside cast long, skeletal shadows that clawed against the tall glass panes of the corridor windows, painting the walls with moving darkness. I walked aimlessly through the vast halls, my soft-soled slippers making almost no sound against the endless expanse of polished stone. The temperature dropped significantly as evening settled, bringing the kind of pervasive chill that seeped into the marrow, regardless of how many roaring fires Clara Higgins lit in the various stone hearths throughout the house. Old money New England wealth was heavy, silent, and traditional, contrasting the cold, clinical boundaries of the architecture with the desperately isolated lives lived within it. I finally reached the heavy arched doorway that marked the boundary of the east wing. My domain, my gilded cage. I slid my hand into the deep pocket of my thick cardigan, my fingers wrapping around a heavy brass key. Alistair had given it to me on my very first night, pressing the cold metal into my palm and telling me to lock the door from the inside if it made me feel secure. I pulled the heavy brass key out, letting it rest on my open palm. It was old, the metal slightly tarnished from decades of use, heavy enough to double as a paperweight. It was the physical manifestation of my autonomy in this massive house, but as I stared at it in the dim, flickering light of a nearby sconce, it felt far more like a barrier. An ironclad reminder that I was merely a guest, a contracted companion, someone meant to remain safely tucked behind a locked door when the day was done. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. I stood in the center of the long, empty hallway, the absolute silence pressing against my ears, so intensely it almost hummed. I craved connection. I craved the messy, warm, imperfect noise of a real home. I longed for the chipped wooden counters of my old life, the comforting, yeasty smell of baking bread, the chaotic, vibrant sound of the street below my tiny apartment window. I had traded my chaotic freedom for absolute, sterile safety, and the isolation was beginning to suffocate me. I closed my fist tightly around the brass key, the dull metal teeth digging sharply into my skin, anchoring my spiraling thoughts to the present moment. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic thud vibrating through the thick wooden floorboards from the corridor directly above me, the West Wing. The master's private sanctuary. I froze, holding my breath. A heavy footfall struck the floorboards. Then a lingering silence. Another strike. Another stretch of quiet. It was the distinct sound of heavy leather boots pacing. A restless, slow, measured cadence that echoed softly through the bones of the ancient house. Alistair was walking the length of his study, turning around and walking back. Over and over. A caged lion trapped in his own immaculate fortress, fighting a silent, exhausting war against the very isolation he had demanded. Without thinking, I moved toward the wall. I pressed my palm flat against the cold, smooth plaster, feeling the faint, almost imperceptible vibration of his footfalls traveling down the structural beams of the estate. One heavy bootfall, a heavy beat of quiet, a second bootfall. I closed my eyes. The chill of the plaster seeped through my palm, but underneath it, buried in the vibration, there was a strange phantom warmth. I adjusted my posture, shifting my weight from my left foot to my right, perfectly matching the rhythm of the muffled sounds above. When he moved forward, I shifted my weight in tandem. When he hesitated at the end of his room to turn around, I lingered perfectly still in the dim shadows of the hallway. We were separated by solid floors, by thick walls, by a contract explicitly designed to keep us emotionally unmoored from one another. Yet, standing there in the bruised twilight, pacing in silent synchronization with a man I barely knew, I felt an agonizingly sharp spark of intimacy. We were like roots from two different trees finding each other beneath the same cold earth, blind, silent, but inextricably drawn to the same source of water. He paced for another 10 minutes. My legs grew tired, the chill of the hallway seeping through my thin slippers, but I refused to move. I refused to let him pace alone in the dark. I stayed with him for every single shift of weight. I didn't mind the cold pressing into my back. I didn't mind the oppressive dark gathering in the corners of the corridor. For those 10 minutes, the vast, empty museum of the estate shrank down to the exact distance between my palm on the plaster and the sole of his boot above. Suddenly, the pacing stopped entirely. The absolute silence that rushed back in had teeth. It was abrupt, jarring, leaving me standing alone in the hallway, with my hand pressed awkwardly against the wall. I dropped my arm quickly, a sudden flush of foolish heat rising to my cheeks. What was I doing? I was acting like a ghost haunting my own life, clinging desperately to the echoes of a man who had explicitly asked me not to expect anything real. I looked down at the heavy brass key, still clutched tightly in my left hand. With a deep, shaky sigh, I turned away from the invisible boundary of the West Wing. I walked back toward my assigned rooms, the fabric of my cardigan pulled tight around my shoulders to ward off the encroaching chill of the house. I reached my solid bedroom door, inserted the key, and turned it. The lock engaged with a heavy final clack that echoed loudly down the empty corridor. I stood in the center of my lavish, lonely bedroom, staring at the perfectly made bed with its pristine, unwrinkled white linens. I had promised him I was entirely content with silence. But as the dark settled fully over the cedarwood trees outside my window, isolating the estate in a sea of night, I realized just how fragile that lie truly was. I didn't want the sterile safety of this quiet arrangement anymore. I wanted the storm pacing in the room above me to finally break. The storm pacing in the room above me did not break the following day, nor the day after. Instead, the heavy silence of the Vance estate simply deepened, settling over the cold marble floors like a fresh layer of winter frost. On the morning of the 4th week, a subtle shift disrupted our established routine. I was sitting in the breakfast room, staring down at a porcelain cup of black tea while the antique clock ticked with a rhythmic finality. Across the polished table, Alistair Vance sat in his usual immaculate stillness. He wore a crisp white shirt without the suit jacket, though the missing wool did nothing to soften the rigid military posture of his shoulders. The swinging door opened with a soft creak. Clara Higgins stepped into the room, holding a small silver tray. Resting precisely in the center of the polished metal was the black velvet invitation. It was an elegant, heavy-textured card. Alistair stared at the velvety rectangle as if it were a highly venomous insect. Slowly, he picked it up and broke the thick wax seal with his thumb, the sharp snap echoing loudly in the quiet room. He read the enclosed parchment in silence, his jaw tightening slightly. He was a man who despised unpredictable variables, preferring the controlled safety of his own sprawling fortress. "The annual winter charity gala," he said, sliding the card across the smooth wood toward me. "It is hosted by a coalition of the city's financial sector. My presence is non-negotiable. As my contracted companion, your presence is required to present a united front to the public." I looked down at the gold foil lettering. It was a stark reminder of the massive, terrifying world of old money wealth I had been bought into. "I understand," I replied softly. I held on to my personal dignity, refusing to let him see the dread forming in my stomach at the thought of facing people who knew exactly how much my father's debts had cost. "We will depart tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, he stated, picking up his fountain pen. The conversation was over. Later that same afternoon, I was summoned to the main drawing room. I stepped through the arched entryway into a space that smelled strongly of dry wood, ash, and old wool, vastly different from the library. Alistair stood near the unlit fireplace, leaving the room trapped in a perpetual chill. His hands were clasped firmly behind his back, his piercing gaze fixed on the low, glass-topped table, resting in the center of the Persian rug. Upon the table sat a large, flat box, tied impeccably with a thick charcoal ribbon. "I took the liberty of having my tailor send something suitable for tomorrow evening," he said, his voice stripped of inflection. "Our arrangement requires that you are outfitted properly to face my associates." I walked slowly toward the table. The box looked completely out of place in the severe masculine room. I stopped at the edge of the glass. He was perhaps 8 feet away, but the psychological distance felt like an uncrossable ocean. I reached out, pulling the knot loose. The silk ribbon fell away with a slithering sound. I lifted the lid to reveal the garment. It was a dark green silk dress. The color was incredibly deep, reminiscent of the shadows hidden within the ancient cedarwood trees outside. The fabric was flawless, catching the dim light and pooling like liquid glass. It was designed to command quiet, absolute respect. I carefully slipped my hand beneath the folds. The material was cold to the touch, slipping through my fingers like water. "It is beautiful, Alistair," I whispered, the words escaping before I could guard them. "Thank you." I turned my head to look at him. His eyes were locked onto my hand, where it rested against the dark green silk. The expression on his face was one of rigid agony. His jaw was clenched so tightly, I could see the muscle ticking beneath his skin. His hands were gripped into white-knuckled fists. He wanted to step forward. I could see the suppressed instinct to close the physical distance, to reach out and touch the fabric, or perhaps my hand. But he did not move a single inch. "The dress is merely a necessity," he said, deliberately taking a half-step backward, retreating deeper into the shadows. "I will not insult you by pretending to understand the mechanics of such garments. Clara will assist you with the fitting." He refused to hand it to me directly. I realized, with a sudden, aching clarity, exactly what he was doing. He was using his wealth, his staff, and his formal etiquette as a barricade. His emotional distance was not a weapon meant to punish me. It was an ironclad shield meant to protect his own unraveling sanity. He was actively guarding his self-discipline, terrified that if he allowed himself to participate in a single moment of genuine warmth, the entire foundation of his controlled life would shatter. "Of course," I replied, my voice returning to its neutral tone. I closed the lid, sealing the silk away. "I will ask Clara for her assistance. Have a good afternoon, Alistair." I picked up the box, anchoring the cardboard against my hip, and walked out of the room. I did not look back, though I could feel the heavy weight of his gaze burning into my spine, until the wooden doors clicked shut behind me. The following evening arrived with a biting, ruthless wind. Inside my bedroom, the atmosphere was entirely different. A fire crackled warmly in my hearth, casting a golden glow over the heavy wooden furniture. Clara stood behind me, her nimble fingers working the delicate, hidden zipper of the dark green silk dress. "It fits perfectly, ma'am," the housekeeper murmured. She took a step back, smoothing her crisp white apron. I turned to face the tall standing mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger. The dark green silk clung to my frame with heavy, elegant grace, falling to the floor in a sheer, unbroken line. My hair had been pinned up in a severe, classic style, exposing the long, vulnerable line of my neck. I looked like a piece of art that Alistair had successfully acquired. Yet, beneath the silk, my heart hammered a frantic rhythm. I picked up a small, black clutch from the bed, took a deep breath, and walked out into the corridor. I descended the grand staircase slowly, the heavy fabric rustling against the cold marble steps. The foyer below was vast, dimly lit by a crystal chandelier that cast fractured prisms of light. Alistair was waiting at the base of the stairs. He wore an immaculate black tuxedo that fit his broad frame with devastating precision. The stark contrast of the black wool and the blinding white of his tailored shirt made him look even more imposing, a monolith of untouchable authority. As my foot touched the final step, he turned to face me. The silence that fell between us was so incredibly dense it felt difficult to breathe. His striking, storm-colored eyes swept over me, starting from the pinned curve of my hair, traveling down the fluid line of the dress, and returning to my face. He did not offer a single word of praise. The air in the foyer simply stopped moving. For a terrifying second, I saw absolute ruin in his expression. It was a look of profound, desperate yearning, violently suppressed by a lifetime of stoic endurance. He looked at me as if I were a fire he was freezing to death in front of, absolutely forbidden from stepping up close enough to feel the heat. Then, the mask slammed back into place. His jaw tightened, the muscles locking down to conceal the fracture. "The car is waiting," he said smoothly, turning sharply toward the heavy front doors, signaling the end of the unspoken moment. I followed him out into the freezing night. The classic sedan idled quietly in the driveway. The chauffeur opened the rear door, and I slid into the expansive back seat, the silk pooling around my legs. The older billionaire climbed in beside me, sealing us into a private rolling sanctuary here. The interior smelled intensely of aged leather and the faint, unmistakable masculine scent of cedarwood that clung to his skin. The ambient lighting was dim, leaving our faces completely shadowed. The drive was agonizingly long. The massive tires hummed a low, hypnotic note against the asphalt. We did not speak. The companion contract dictated that we share physical space without demanding emotional labor, and we were both executing the terms with flawless obedience. I stared out the tinted window, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the man sitting only inches to my left. His proximity was a gravitational pull, a silent force that demanded all of my internal focus to resist leaning into. Some places don't wait to be found, they call to you in silence. This dark, quiet car, moving through the frozen New England landscape, felt more like home than any building I had ever lived in. I wanted to cross the trivial distance separating us, and rest my hand against his arm. I wanted to know if the winter stone of his exterior would finally crack under a gentle touch, but I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, anchoring myself to reality. I was a debt paid, an arrangement formalized on parchment. I was not meant to ask for more. Nearly an hour later, the sedan slowed, turning onto the long approach of the grand estate, hosting the charity gala. A massive crowd of photographers and society reporters clustered near the entrance, their camera flashes exploding in a rapid, strobing assault against the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. The panic of my old life, the poverty, the hiding from debt collectors, the constant fear of exposure, clashed violently with this opulent display of wealth. I was about to be thrust into a spotlight I did not earn. My fingers tightened around my small clutch. The car glided to a halt. The chauffeur opened my door, and the freezing wind rushed into the cabin, carrying the loud, overlapping shouts of the press. Alistair stepped out first on his side, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. He walked around the rear of the sedan and stopped in front of my open door. He did not extend his hand for me to take. A handhold would imply intimate partnership. Instead, he presented his arm, a formal, rigid barrier of black wool. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice pitched so low that only I could hear it over the roar of the crowd. I stepped out, the bitter cold instantly slicing through my thin attire. I reached up and placed my hand lightly against the crook of his arm. The muscles beneath the fine wool were hard as iron, completely tense and ready for impact. We turned toward the towering, illuminated entrance of the venue. The ground beneath us was a sprawling expanse of slick gravel, covered in a treacherous, thin sheen of winter ice. I took my first step, and the heel of my shoe immediately slipped against a frozen stone. My heart leapt into my throat. If I stumbled, I would instantly become the helpless, uncultured liability the society pages desperately wanted me to be. I braced myself for the humiliating impact, expecting my escort to abruptly grab my waist to haul me upright, a jarring motion that would undoubtedly draw pitying photographs. But he didn't grab me. Instead of drawing attention to my vulnerability, Alistair seamlessly shifted his entire center of gravity. With terrifyingly precise kinetic awareness, he adjusted his own walking stride mid-step, matching my faltering angle perfectly. He widened his stance by a fraction of an inch, absorbing my sudden imbalance completely into his own massive frame. He became an immovable anchor, catching my weight without his arm ever visibly moving. To the hundreds of watching eyes and the rapid-fire lenses of the cameras, nothing had happened. We simply looked like a flawless, unified couple gliding up the gravel path, our steps perfectly synchronized. Write the life you want. I'll meet you there. The thought echoed unbidden in my mind as I regained my footing, my hand resting lightly on his arm. He hadn't rescued me like a damsel in distress. He had quietly altered his own physical reality to ensure I never lost my balance in the first place. He had protected my dignity with such absolute devotion that it brought a stinging burn of tears to my eyes. He demanded a world of cold rules, yet he operated entirely on a language of hidden care. "I have you, Beatrice," he breathed, the words barely a whisper against the freezing wind. "Keep walking." We reached the top of the stone steps, stepping into the blinding, golden warmth of the grand ballroom. The massive double doors sealed behind us, muffling the chaotic noise of the press, leaving us standing at the precipice of a glittering, dangerous new world. I did not pull my hand away from his arm. I stood a little taller, drawing strength from the steady pulse beating beneath the black wool of his tuxedo. We presented a perfectly united front, bound together not by the ink on a companion contract, but by the undeniable warmth slowly thawing between us. The grand ballroom was a sensory assault of unimaginable wealth. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, painted with faded frescoes of mythological figures that looked down upon the modern aristocracy with silent judgment. 3 massive crystal chandeliers hung suspended by thick brass chains, casting a brilliant fractured light that caught the sharp edges of diamond necklaces and the dark lapels of custom tuxedos. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, heavy floral perfumes, and the sharp tang of poured champagne. A string quartet played a sweeping waltz from a raised dais, their music battling constantly against the low hum of 100 overlapping conversations. It was an environment designed to make an outsider feel infinitely small. For the first 30 minutes, Alistair Vance had not left my side. He had navigated the treacherous waters of high society, with the practiced ease of an apex predator swimming through familiar currents. My protector had introduced me simply as his companion, offering no further explanation, his tone leaving absolutely no room for follow-up questions. His physical presence had been an iron shield deflecting the curious stares of the city's elite. But a few moments ago, a coalition of board members had cornered the billionaire near the main bar, insisting on a brief word. He had looked at me, a silent question in his guarded expression, and I had offered a tight nod, retreating to a quiet alcove framed by heavy velvet curtains to wait for his return. I held a fragile crystal champagne glass in my left hand, the condensation slipping down the stem to dampen my trembling fingers. The dark green silk of my dress felt like a layer of armor, a beautiful barricade against the judgment of the room. Yet, without his solid weight standing beside me, the sheer scale of the estate began to press against my chest. I watched the swirling crowd from the shadows, feeling entirely unmoored, like a ghost haunting a life I did not rightfully belong to. It is quite a spectacle, isn't it? The voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely unwelcome. I turned slowly, my grip tightening on the stem of my glass. Julian Thorne stepped into the dim light of the alcove. He was a man composed entirely of sharp edges, wearing a midnight blue tuxedo that felt a fraction too flashy for the traditional setting. His dark hair was styled with arrogant precision, and his flat, opaque brown eyes swept over me, with the calculating assessment of an auctioneer evaluating a piece of property. He was one of Alistair's primary business rivals, notorious for his ruthless acquisitions and his manipulative charm. "Mr. Thorne," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I did not step back. I refused to yield the small physical space I occupied, drawing upon years of surviving debt collectors. "It is a beautiful event." Julian smiled, a thin, predatory curving of his lips that did not reach his cold eyes. He stepped closer, deliberately invading the polite perimeter of personal space that usually governed these interactions. He smelled of heavy cologne, a sharp, suffocating contrast to the clean scent of cedarwood that I had grown accustomed to. "Beautiful, yes. And highly exclusive," the businessman murmured, his gaze dropping deliberately to the hem of my gown before rising back to my face in an insulting sweep. I must admit, when I heard rumors that Alistair had taken a companion, I assumed it was a misinterpretation of some new corporate asset. But here you are, a living, breathing investment. Tell me, Miss Finch, how does one transition so quickly from a crumbling neighborhood on the wrong side of the city to the east wing of the Vance estate? Was it a difficult negotiation? Or did your father's rather massive debts make the terms somewhat non-negotiable? The insult was not shouted. It was delivered with the hushed tone of a shared secret. It was a precise strike designed to strip away my dignity and remind me of the deeply transactional nature of my existence. He wanted me to flush with shame, to look down at the floor like the helpless charity case he believed me to be. My heart slammed violently against my ribs, a sudden rush of adrenaline flooding my veins. But I did not shrink. I held his gaze with a cold, unyielding stare, utilizing the same quiet resilience that had kept my family afloat during our darkest years. "My arrangement with my companion is entirely our own business, Mr. Thorne," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the panic vibrating beneath my skin. If you have questions regarding his investments, I suggest you take them up with his board of directors. The rival's smile faltered, his massive ego bruised by my refusal to cower. His flat eyes hardened, the thin veneer of polite society charm slipping away to reveal the arrogant bully hiding underneath. You play the part well, I'll give you that, he sneered softly, leaning against the velvet curtain. But putting heavy silk on a desperate girl doesn't change what she is. You are a placeholder, a debt paid to keep the house from feeling too empty, and the older billionaire does not do romance. He acquires things, and when he is bored with them, he leaves them locked in quiet rooms. He stepped even closer, the heat of his body radiating an uncomfortable pressure in the narrow space. Out on the floor, the string quartet shifted into a faster, more demanding tempo. Let us see how well you perform on the floor, the younger man said, dropping all pretense of polite conversation. Before I could anticipate the movement, his hand shot out, his fingers clamped brutally around my right wrist, his grip shockingly tight, the metal of his heavy gold signet ring digging painfully into my delicate skin. Come, he commanded, attempting to pull me out of the secluded alcove and directly into the center of the crowded ballroom. It was a blatant display of dominance. A manipulative mind game designed to humiliate my protector by parading me in front of the press as a helpless pawn. He pulled, expecting me to stumble forward, expecting me to gasp or cause a messy scene that would draw the hungry eyes of the elite. But I did not move. I did not scream. I did not yank my arm back in a frantic, undignified physical struggle. Instead, I froze the muscles in my shoulder, locked my elbow, and deliberately shifted my entire center of gravity downward, anchoring my heels firmly into the thick carpet of the alcove. I turned myself into a statue of emerald fabric and immovable will. The man tugged again, harder this time, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing his polished face when my body refused to follow the momentum of his arm. The champagne in my glass trembled wildly, a few drops spilling over the crystal rim to land on the floor, but I kept my hand perfectly steady. Let go of my wrist, I said. My voice was not loud, but it was laced with absolute, razor-sharp authority. It was the voice of a woman who had spent years negotiating with the worst elements of the city, a woman who knew exactly how to hold her ground when the world tried to forcefully push her down. Don't cause a scene, Beatrice, he hissed, his grip tightening until a dull ache radiated up my forearm. It's just a dance. People are beginning to look. Then they will see you assaulting a woman who has explicitly told you to let her go, I replied, my eyes locked on his, entirely unblinking. I will not ask you again. I maintained my poise under the crushing weight of his physical intimidation. I was terrified, the pulse in my throat beating a frantic rhythm, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of witnessing my panic. I held onto my personal dignity like an iron shield, turning the quiet alcove into a silent, unyielding battlefield. The oppressive tension in the small space shattered not with a shout, but with a sudden, precipitous drop in temperature that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I believe the lady gave you an instruction, Julian. The voice did not come from behind me. It came from the deep shadows just to the left of the heavy velvet curtain. It was low, gravelly, and vibrating with a lethal, terrifying calmness that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Julian froze, his posture instantly turning rigid. The arrogant sneer vanished entirely from his face, replaced by a pale, instinctual caution that widened his eyes. Alistair stepped into the dim light of the alcove. He did not look at me. His absolute focus was locked entirely on the man currently holding my wrist. The stoic titan did not raise his fists. He did not shout or make a scene. He simply stood there, a monolith of winter stone, his massive frame blocking the only exit, exuding a dominant social grace that immediately shrank the arrogant rival down to the size of a frightened, cornered child. Alistair, the younger man stammered, frantically attempting to recover his polished veneer. He forced a hollow, highly nervous laugh, though his fingers remained clamped around my arm. I was merely inviting your companion to join the floor. She seems a bit lost without you hovering. My protector took one slow, deliberate step forward. The air between them seemed to physically crackle and freeze. He did not look at Julian's face. He looked only at the businessman's hand where it gripped my skin with bruising force. Remove your hand, Alistair said softly. It was not a request. It was a fact of nature as absolute and undeniable as the pull of gravity. Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second, his bruised pride battling desperately against his undeniable fear, but the sheer, predatory stillness in the older billionaire's posture offered a silent, devastating promise of complete and utter ruin. The younger man swallowed hard, his fingers springing open as if the dark silk of my sleeve had suddenly caught fire. He stepped back quickly, wiping his hand on his tuxedo trousers in a jerky, uncoordinated motion that stripped him of any remaining dignity. "There's no need for hostility, Vance," the defeated rival muttered, his eyes darting frantically toward the safety of the crowded ballroom just beyond the curtains. It was a misunderstanding, nothing more. Alistair finally shifted his gaze to the other man's face. The look of cold, calculating disdain in his pale eyes was absolute, a chilling reminder of exactly how he had all built his massive empire. "If you ever approach her again," he murmured, his voice so quiet it barely carried over the swelling music of the quartet, "I will not simply ruin your business. I will dismantle your entire life to the point where your own name becomes a memory you wish you could forget. Do you understand me?" Julian did not offer a witty retort. He did not attempt to salvage his damaged ego. He simply gave a jerky, humiliating nod, turned swiftly on his heel, and fled the alcove, disappearing into the sea of dancing couples like a ghost entirely banished by the harsh light of dawn. The silence that rushed back into the small, curtained space was deafening. The adrenaline that had kept my spine rigid suddenly evaporated, leaving me trembling slightly in the aftermath of the intense confrontation. I looked down at my right wrist. A faint, angry red mark had bloomed against my pale skin, where the heavy ring had dug brutally into my flesh. I drew a shaky breath, preparing to apologize for the unwanted scene, preparing to retreat back behind the cold, transactional boundaries of our companion contract. I expected him to be furious, to reprimand me for drawing negative attention from his peers. But before I could speak, Alistair moved. He stepped directly into my personal space, closing the agonizing psychological distance that usually separated us in the quiet halls of his estate. He reached out, his movements incredibly slow and deliberate, completely contradicting the violent, terrifying intensity that had radiated from him only seconds before. He took the fragile crystal from my trembling left hand and set the stemware quietly on a nearby marble pedestal, effectively disarming me. Then, he reached for my right arm. He did not grab me or assert control. He offered his large, calloused hand, palm up, a silent question hanging heavily in the charged air between us. I hesitated, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, before I slowly lifted my hand and placed it trustingly in his. His long fingers closed around mine. They were warm, solid, and incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the bruising grip I had just endured. With excruciating, deliberate care, Alistair shifted his hold, sliding his hand down, until his thumb rested directly over the faint red mark the rival had left on my wrist. The heat of his skin instantly began to soothe the stinging ache, a silent, profound act of physical translation. He was utilizing his own warmth to calm my racing pulse, grounding me in the present moment, deliberately erasing the ghost of the other man's violent touch. He looked down at me, his pale gray eyes dark, with an emotion so raw and unguarded that it literally stole the breath from my lungs. The stoic, trauma-walled protector had completely dropped his armor, leaving his absolute vulnerability exposed in the dim light. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a rough, broken whisper that lacked any of its usual commanding authority. "No," I breathed, entirely unable to look away from his intense gaze. "I am fine, Alistair, thank you." He did not release my hand. Instead, his thumb stroked a slow, rhythmic circle over my pulse point, mapping the frantic beating of my heart. "He touched you," he murmured, the words tight, with a deeply suppressed, fiercely protective jealousy. "I left you alone for 5 minutes, and he laid his hands on you." "I did not let him move me," I replied quietly, lifting my chin, determined to show him that I was not a broken, fragile thing in need of pity. I held my ground. Alistair's jaw flexed, a look of profound, aching reverence passing over his sharp features as he processed my defiance. "I know you did," he said softly, his thumb continuing its soothing motion against my skin. "You are the strongest person in this room, Beatrice. But you should never have had to stand alone. Tell me to stop, his eyes seemed to say, though the words never crossed his lips. He was offering me an exit, a chance to step back, to rebuild the sterile, safe walls of our written agreement and return to our emotionally distant lives. But as I looked up at the man who had bought my massive debts, who paced the floors in silent synchronization with my unbearable loneliness, who had just used his immense social power not to control me, but to protect my personal dignity, I knew I didn't want the walls anymore. Without breaking our intense eye contact, Alistair smoothly stepped backward, drawing me with him out of the shadows of the alcove and directly into the brilliant, fractured light of the grand ballroom. He did not lead me toward the exit or the safety of the waiting car. He led me straight toward the center of the crowded dance floor. The string quartet transitioned seamlessly into a slow, sweeping, deeply melancholic waltz. The surrounding crowd parted for him instinctively, the high society elite giving way to the undeniable, gravitational pull of his presence, as if he commanded the very air in the room. He turned to face me under the bright crystal chandeliers. He placed his right hand firmly against the small of my back, his broad palm radiating a steady, grounding heat through the thick fabric of my gown. He lifted my left hand, weaving his fingers perfectly and securely through mine. "Follow me," he whispered, his breath warm against my temple. We stepped into the dance. It was an effortless, commanding grace. Alistair moved not like a man performing a tedious social obligation for the press, but like a man who had waited his entire life to hold a specific, cherished weight in his arms. The rest of the massive ballroom simply fell away. The blinding lights, the overlapping, judgmental conversations, the prying eyes of his corporate peers. All of it dissolved into a blurry, entirely meaningless background. There was only the heavy, rhythmic sweep of the classical music, the intoxicating scent of cedarwood, and the intense, agonizingly slow burn of our bodies moving in perfect synchronization. I followed Hawk led, my feet gliding flawlessly over the polished wood floor. He held me much closer than polite society strictly dictated, his broad chest brushing against mine with every sweeping turn. The physical proximity was overwhelming, a terrifying, beautiful collapse of every single boundary we had explicitly sworn to maintain on the day we signed the papers. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. His face was a study in fierce, unwavering concentration, his gaze locked onto mine with a possessiveness that had absolutely nothing to do with toxic ownership, and everything to do with pure, absolute devotion. He wasn't looking at a contracted companion fulfilling a duty. He was looking at the woman he had silently chosen to protect against the rest of the world, not because it was his contractual obligation, but because he could no longer imagine drawing a breath without her by his side. My left hand tightened instinctively around his warm fingers. His hand on my lower back pressed me just a fraction closer, a silent, devastatingly clear answer to the terrifying question I hadn't dared to ask aloud. We danced in the absolute center of a room, filled with hundreds of people, yet we were entirely, completely alone. The silence that had once defined the cold, sterile distance between us and the New England estate had fundamentally transformed. It was no longer a heavy, isolating barrier. It was a warm, shared sanctuary. The formal agreement, with its neat signatures and clear emotional boundaries, was burning to ash in the heat of his protective gaze. I rested my cheek against the solid, unyielding line of his shoulder, closing my eyes, and for the first time since my father's debts had ruined my life, I truly felt the weight of a profound realization. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person. The drive back to the New England estate was enveloped in a silence that bore absolutely no resemblance to the cold, clinical distance of our previous journeys. Inside the dimly lit cabin of the sedan, the atmosphere was thick, heavy, and pulsing with the unsaid weight of the last hour, the chaotic sensory assault of the grand ballroom, the sharp tang of poured champagne, the blinding flash of cameras, the oppressive hum of high society judgment, had all been severed the moment the heavy car doors clicked shut. Now, there was only the low, hypnotic hum of the massive tires gliding over frozen asphalt and the intense, inescapable physical gravity of the man sitting beside me. I did not press my shoulder against the far door to maintain a polite perimeter. I did not keep my hands folded in a tight, nervous knot of defensive energy. Instead, I let the dark green silk of my dress pool freely across the leather seat, closing the trivial gap between us until the side of my knee occasionally brushed against the fine black wool of his tuxedo trousers. Every time our completely accidental points of contact occurred, I felt a distinct, involuntary tightening in his jaw, a sharp intake of breath that he desperately tried to conceal beneath his stoic exterior. He was staring out the tinted window into the sprawling, snow-dusted darkness of the passing tree line. The intermittent glow of passing streetlights washed over his sharp profile in rhythmic waves, illuminating a face that looked entirely carved from winter stone. Yet, beneath that immovable facade, I could sense the chaotic, violent storm he was actively fighting to contain. His hands were resting on his thighs, his fingers curled inward, locked in a rigid battle for self-control. He was terrified. The man who bought corporate empires without a second thought was completely paralyzed by the sudden, undeniable shattering of the rules he had built to survive. When the sedan finally crested the long, winding driveway and came to a halt in front of the Vance estate, the sprawling stone mansion loomed against the night sky like an ancient fortress. But as I looked up at the towering cedarwood trees and the tall, dark windows, the psychological terror that had accompanied my first arrival here was entirely gone. It no longer felt like a gilded cage or a sterile museum designed to house a desperate debt bride. It felt profoundly and undeniably like the threshold of a real home. The chauffeur opened the door. The biting, ruthless winter wind rushed into the cabin, slicing at my exposed skin. But before the chill could fully register, Alistair was there. He offered his arm with the same impeccable, old-world courtesy he always possessed. But this time, the gesture lacked its usual rigid formality. It was an offering, a silent plea for connection. I placed my hand in the crook of his arm, letting the solid warmth of his body shield me from the freezing air as we walked up the icy gravel path. The towering front doors swung open as we approached. Clara Higgins stood in the grand foyer, her crisp white apron glowing faintly in the dim light of the crystal chandelier. The observant housekeeper stepped forward to take my coat, her sharp eyes flicking briefly between Alistair's tight expression and my own flushed face. She did not ask about the gala. She did not inquire if the evening had been a success. She simply absorbed the fundamental shift in the air, offering a small, knowing nod that spoke volumes of her deep loyalty to the silent rhythms of this house. "That will be all for tonight, Clara," Alistair murmured, his gravelly voice sounding unusually strained, almost ragged at the edges. "You may retire." "Good night, Mr. Vance." "Good night, ma'am," she replied softly, disappearing into the shadows of the servant corridors with a graceful, ghost-like efficiency. We were left entirely alone in the massive, echoing expanse of the foyer. I turned toward the grand staircase, fully expecting the older billionaire to reinstate our physical boundaries and direct me toward the isolated safety of the East Wing. I prepared myself for the familiar, agonizingly polite dismissal that usually ended our days. "Beatrice." His voice stopped me before my foot could even touch the first marble step. I turned back slowly. He was standing near the entrance of the main corridor, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a heavy, labored breath. "Come with me to the library," he requested softly. It was not a command, it was a deeply vulnerable invitation, completely stripped of his usual absolute authority. I nodded silently, following him down the long, shadowed hallway. The familiar scent of old paper, dry wood ash, and bitter polish greeted us as he pushed the heavy oak doors open. The vast room was engulfed in absolute darkness, save for the pale moonlight spilling through the tall glass panes, illuminating the dancing dust motes in silver beams. The grand hearth was completely unlit, its cold marble swept meticulously clean, a stark reminder of the emotional temperature we had previously sworn to maintain. Alistair did not turn on the brass reading lamps. He did not walk to his usual high-backed armchair or position himself behind the massive mahogany table. Instead, he walked directly to the center of the room and stopped in front of the cold fireplace, turning his back to me. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the library was the frantic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hall. The silence was incredibly heavy, pressing against my eardrums, but I refused to fill it with meaningless chatter. I stood near the edge of the Persian rug, clutching my small black purse, waiting for the stoic protector to finally dismantle the last remaining pieces of his armor. Suddenly, Alistair raised his hands to his throat, with jerky, trembling fingers that completely betrayed his lifelong dedication to immaculate composure. He gripped the knot of his silk bow tie and pulled it loose. The fabric hung limply against his crisp white shirt. His hands moved to the top button of his collar, struggling for a fraction of a second against the stiff cotton before wrenching it open. It was a rare, startling fracture in his perfect, unyielding exterior, a physical manifestation of a man suffocating under the weight of his own desperate restraint. He dropped his hands, letting them hang heavily at his sides, before slowly lifting them again into the pale moonlight. He looked down at his own palms, staring at the calluses, the faint scars, the undeniable physical evidence of a long, difficult life. "I am 52 years old, Beatrice," he whispered to the empty, unlit hearth, his voice vibrating with a raw, agonizing sorrow that shattered my heart. "I have spent 3 decades building an empire out of winter stone and cold steel. I have lived a life entirely devoid of warmth, convincing myself that isolation was the only acceptable price for absolute control." He slowly turned to face me. The moonlight caught the silver flecks in his hair and the deep, tired lines around his eyes. He looked entirely broken, stripped of his immense wealth and corporate power, standing before me simply as a deeply insecure, terrified human being. "When I signed the papers to clear your father's debts, I convinced myself I was performing a practical transaction," he continued, taking a hesitant half-step forward, though he forcibly stopped himself from closing the distance. "I wanted a companion to occupy the empty chairs in this museum. I wanted someone to share the silence, to prove that I was not completely a ghost in my own home. I swore I would never touch you. I swore I would never demand anything beyond your presence, because I have always known, that I am entirely unworthy of your vibrant, beautiful youth." My breath hitched in my throat, but I remained perfectly still, letting him pour the poison of his own self-doubt out onto the floor. "You are meant for a life of chaotic, beautiful noise," he said, his voice cracking violently on the final word. He looked down at his weathered hands again, his jaw trembling. "You are meant for sunlight, for a partner, who can offer you an unburdened future, not an old man whose hands are too rough, too stained by the past, to hold something as fragile and perfect as you. I built these rules, these separate wings, not to keep you out, but to protect you from me, to ensure I didn't steal your best years out of pure, selfish desperation." He closed his eyes, a single silent tear escaping to trace a silver path down his rigid cheek. "But tonight, when I saw him put his hands on you, when I realized that my distance had left you vulnerable in a room full of wolves, I knew I could no longer maintain the lie. I cannot stay in the West Wing, Beatrice. I cannot sit across from you at that mahogany table and pretend I do not want to spend the rest of my life breathing the same air as you." The absolute surrender of the powerful, unyielding giant was complete. He stood there, deeply humbled, offering me the greatest gift a man like him could ever give, the total relinquishment of his pride. I did not offer a grand, dramatic declaration. I did not rush forward in a tearful frenzy. I simply dropped my small black clutch onto the floor, the soft thud echoing loudly in the quiet room. I crossed the psychological ocean that had separated us for 2 months, stepping directly into his personal space, breaching the final perimeter of his defensive walls. I reached out and took his weathered, trembling hands in mine. The contrast of his rough calluses against my soft skin was stark, a physical grounding in the reality of our shared existence. I tightened my grip, refusing to let him pull away, anchoring him to the present moment. "Look at me, Alistair," I commanded softly. He opened his eyes, the raw vulnerability in them, making my chest ache with a profound, overwhelming tenderness. "Not because I owe you for my father's debts. Not because I pity your isolation, and certainly not because I lack choices," I said, utilizing the very cadence he had used to push me away, turning the negative clauses into a foundation of absolute truth. "But because you are the only man who has ever paced the floorboards above me, just to ensure I wasn't lonely in the dark. Because you are the only man who adjusts his own stride on winter ice to protect my dignity, instead of demanding my gratitude." I lifted my right hand, brushing my thumb gently across his cheek, wiping away the trace of his tear. The skin beneath my fingers was warm and incredibly real. "I do not want a young, chaotic love," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I have spent my entire life surviving chaos. I want a quiet room. I want a heavy porcelain teapot. I want the scent of cedarwood. And I want the man who stands in front of me right now. You are not holding me back, Alistair. You are the only place I have ever wanted to stay." A shuddering breath ripped through his chest. The heavy, protective armor he had worn for decades finally, permanently, shattered. He dropped his head, resting his forehead against mine, his large hands coming up to cradle my face with such exquisite, desperate care that I thought my heart might burst. He breathed me in, the lavender and cedarwood mixing in the small space between us, cementing our shared reality. "Then let us rewrite the rules," he murmured against my skin, his voice regaining a fraction of its gravelly strength, though it was now laced with profound relief. He stepped back, though he kept one hand firmly wrapped around my fingers. He led me toward the massive mahogany reading table in the center of the library. Reaching into the top drawer of his desk, he retrieved a thick manila envelope. With precise, deliberate movements, he pulled out the original companion contract. The thick parchment, covered in stark black ink, looked incredibly cold and clinical under the faint moonlight. He laid the document flat on the polished wood. He reached for his silver fountain pen, unscrewed the cap, and held it out to me. He was offering me total agency, refusing to dictate the terms of our new life. I took the cold metal pen. The weight of it felt monumental in my hand. I leaned over the table, my dark green silk dress whispering against the wood. I found Clause 4, the section explicitly mandating separate living quarters, in the east and west wings. With a thick, heavy stroke of dark ink, I crossed it out entirely. I moved down to Clause 7, the brutal paragraph demanding no emotional expectations and defining our arrangement as purely transactional. I drew a fierce, undeniable line through every single word, erasing the sterile boundaries that had caused us both so much silent agony. Alistair watched me, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his eyes tracking the destructive movement of the nib with fierce, absolute devotion. At the very bottom of the final page, beneath the ruins of the old agreement, I pressed the pen to the paper one last time. In my own careful handwriting, I wrote a single, simple sentence. I promised to stay in the silence, and in the noise, as a true and equal wife. I capped the pen and set it down. The harsh, clinical transaction was dead. In its place, a self-authorized choice had bloomed. The soft creak of the library doors broke the profound quiet of the room. Clara Higgins stepped into the room, seemingly materializing out of the shadows. In her hands, she carried a gleaming silver tray. She did not ask why the lights were off, nor did she comment on Alistair's undone collar, or my discarded purse on the floor. She simply walked to the small side table, situated near the grand fireplace, and set the tray down with a soft metallic clink. Resting in the center was the heavy porcelain teapot, its faded blue vines a symbol of the quiet, domestic sanctuary we had slowly built together. The warm, earthy scent of chamomile and a sharp trace of peppermint instantly filled the chilled air, cutting through the smell of old paper and sealing the memory of this night into my senses forever. "I thought perhaps you both might require something warm," Clara murmured, her voice carrying a rare, gentle warmth. She offered a deep, respectful nod to us both, a silent acknowledgement of the fundamental shift in the house, before turning and pulling the doors quietly shut behind her. Alistair looked at the tray and then at me, a slow, incredibly beautiful smile. The first genuine smile I had ever seen grace his features, broke through the stoic lines of his face. It transformed him entirely, erasing the years of winter stone, leaving behind a man who had finally found his way out of the cold. We did not return to our separate armchairs across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. Instead, Alistair guided me to a small, plush love seat tucked near the unlit hearth. We sat down together, the physical distance between us entirely eliminated. He poured the steaming amber liquid into 2 fragile cups, handing one to me before taking his own. He didn't return to a ledger. He didn't check the time. He simply sat beside me, his thigh pressed warmly against mine, beneath the heavy folds of my silk dress, his arm resting casually across the back of the sofa behind my shoulders. We drank our tea in a comfortable, deeply peaceful silence. It was no longer a silence built on fear, or a cautious dance around emotional landmines. It was the quiet, steady rhythm of two guarded souls who had finally dropped their armor and found safety in each other's presence. The sprawling New England estate, with its ancient cedarwood trees and vast marble halls, was no longer a museum of someone else's life. It was just a house. And the man sitting beside me, radiating a quiet, unwavering protection, was my true home. People ask sometimes, what makes a true vow? I don't believe it is found in grand public declarations, or in the flawless terms of a legally binding contract. I think the real vow is the courage to stand in a quiet room, to drop your heavy armor, and to offer someone a warm cup of tea when the rest of the world has gone dark. That is what I call forever. If this story brought you a sense of peace tonight, or if you believe that true love is built in quiet, consistent presence, please take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for sitting in the quiet with us.